Switch it on is always a good idea. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome to this afternoon's policy dialogue hosted by the EPC in cooperation. And this is what I'm very proud of with IPQ, Internationale Politik Quarterly. I'll tell you in a moment what IPQ is. But first of all, thank you for finding the way today to after Trump's victory, we're thinking European defense, which is the topic of this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to moderate this very first event in cooperation with the EPC, which I want to thank at this point already for making this possible and for being such a fantastic partner. I'm happy to say. The idea is to dive a little deeper into the theme of our fall 2024 issue, Rethinking European Defense. The issue appeared before November the 5th, in late September, in fact, at a point when a return of Donald Trump was a distinct possibility, but far from a certainty. Now, however, this rethinking we would like to propel takes place under the shadow of a second Trump administration and makes the task so much more urgent, in my view. Facilitating reflection and debate is, of course, at the very heart of what we do at Internationale Politik Quarterly, the English edition of Germany's leading foreign affairs magazine, Internationale Politik. In our 4 issues per year, we aim at setting Germany's and Europe's foreign and security affairs agenda, complemented by an active website and social media channels. We also host quarterly online IPQ debates, launched this year. In its current form, the journal exists since late 2020. Next year will be our 5th anniversary. High time, we thought, to make a concerted effort to reach out to readers' actual or potential in Brussels, the EU's capital. We do this afternoon with a stellar panel, which I'd like to introduce to you now. In order of appearance, we have with us Diego de Ojeda García-Pardo, who is head of unit for coordination of foreign security and defense policy implementation as the Secretary General of the European Commission. He has been working for the Commission for over a decade and has thus vast experience on the topic we want to discuss this afternoon. Warm welcome, Diego. Also with us is Tania Lațici. I asked beforehand, and who is a political officer focusing on peace, security, and defense with the European External Action Service, the EU's diplomatic service. Tania is also an associate fellow at ECMAN, the Royal Institute for International Relations here in Brussels, where she focuses on European defense and security, and a non-resident fellow with the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, where she contributes on the same policy areas as well as transatlantic defense. Welcome, Tania. And virtually, we are joined by Luke Coffey. Hello, Luke. Thank you very much for making it. Senior fellow at the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute, where he analyzes national security and foreign policy with a focus on Europe, Eurasia, NATO, and transatlantic relations. He was previously director of the Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation from 2015 to 2022. And before that, Margaret Thatcher Fellow at Heritage, focusing on relations between the United States and the United Kingdom, as well as on the role of NATO and the EU in transatlantic and Eurasian security. He has experience working both in Afghanistan and Ukraine, and what I found particularly impressive, he has lived in 4 continents and visited over 70 countries. Today, he visits only remotely, but we are the more grateful for having you today here. Welcome, Luke. And last but not least, we have with us Mihai Sebastian Chihaia, who is a policy analyst in the Europe in the World program here at the EPC. Inter alia, Mihai works on EU Middle East relations as well as on EU foreign policy and European defense integration. Before joining the EPC, Mihai worked for the European Business Summit, and prior to that, he was part of the security and defense program of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where he focused on transatlantic relations, US foreign policy, cybersecurity, and NATO policy, and Mihai also contributed to the current IPQ Fall Issue. Have a look if you have the time. Welcome, Mihai. And to kick us off, or before we kick off, actually, I have one question for our panelists, a very quick one, and then we go deeper into the topic. What I also wanted to mention is that afterwards there will be a reception. So if you got time to stay a little for a glass of wine and have a further discussion with our panelists, you're most welcome to do so. But I want to start with a quick reaction from each of our panelists, sort of how severe or sort of how do you gauge Europe, the security situation Europe finds itself in today? We start with Diego. 1 word or 1 minute.
Yes, well, good afternoon, and many thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. What is the situation, the security and defense situation of Europe right now? I think it's fragile. Not up to the threats that we face. So we're ill-prepared. We were ill-prepared before the Russian fully-fledged invasion of Ukraine. We're even worse prepared now because a lot of member states have donated vast amounts of equipment, so stockpiles are lower. But we seem to be lacking funding. We need to spend more on defense. We don't have enough weapons, stocks, ammunition. And we don't have the production capacity to produce the weapons that we need and to replace them.
Okay, I think the 1 minute is up. Fragile is the word I remember most. Tania.
I'm not sure that's working, but if everyone hears me in the back, maybe this is okay.
Since we're recording, maybe it's better.
It works. Yeah. But you need to.
Yeah.
Hello. Yes. Okay. All right. I mean, when you ask this question, the only thing I can think of is this American expression saying, "As serious as a heart attack." You know, how serious is the situation? As serious as a heart attack, and you know, just sharing a personal note here. Last week, I lost a very beloved pet, unfortunately, to a heart attack. So its seriousness is actually very vivid to me right now. And I think as one does when something bad happens, you think, what could I have done to prevent this? And what can I do better in the future? And I think that's where we are with European defense as well. So it's about learning from the mistakes that we've made in the past, and then it's about trying to anticipate a bit the future. And I think 2 concrete things that we can do is, first of all, support Ukraine. Second of all, boost defense readiness, according to what Diego just said as well.
Thank you very much. Luke, so what would be your 1 minute definition of where Europe is at?
Thank you. Thanks, EPC, for inviting me here to participate, at least virtually. I wish I was there with you. Look, we're 3 years into what is the largest land war in Europe since the 1940s. Every single night, Iranian-produced drones hit Ukrainian cities, sometimes straying into other European countries. We now know that North Korean ballistic missiles are used, and we know that there are at least 10,000 North Korean soldiers now in Europe fighting in this European war. And allegedly, ICBM was used, or something similar to an ICBM was used to send a message to us just last night by Russia in Ukraine. But again, 3 years later, we are still having conversations and conferences and events about what should Europe do. So to me, that is a sign that things are not on track.
Not on track. Thank you very much. So we've got fragile, we've got a serious as a heart attack. We have got just heard from Luke and Mihai. What is your?
Well, maybe just to complement on what Luke said, just if we set aside a bit the land war dimension, there are other dimensions that are very relevant at the same time. If you, of course, watch the news in the last couple of days, we've seen undersea cables being severed in the Baltic Sea, which shows the dimension of hybrid threats that we're facing. On top of this, there is another dimension in Europe's neighborhood, and I'm talking about, of course, the war in the Middle East, the tension, but also the crisis in the Red Sea. So I would say that we are probably at the most dangerous moment in the last couple of decades.
Okay, it's a pretty bleak picture, isn't it? Let's start with Diego again, sort of to give us some context and background on where the European Union is in terms of sort of beefing up its defense efforts. You've been observing it very closely. You've been part of the effort. Where are we today? And on the 1st of December, we've got a second commission led by Ursula von der Leyen coming in officially now with a defense commissioner for the first time. What change will that mean or bring about?
Thank you. It's not like Luke says that we're still thinking what should be done. We have made a number of proposals, and this have been, some of which have been adopted by the member states. They have committed to do a number of things in the context of the strategic compass. We just tabled a defense industrial strategy in March, together with the High Representative, and an industrial program, EDIS and EDIP by their acronyms. We presented, and these were adopted, 2 proposals to promote joint procurement of weapons by member states and to ramp up industrial production. We did not have a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money. It was 300 and 500 million. I can do a lot with that, but when it comes to weapons, it's not that much. But well, we didn't have more, but it was still a lot more than we had before. So we've done things. And in this industrial strategy that we tabled in March, I would argue that, you have most of the key issues that we need to address are there. And we are implementing those that we, the institutions, can implement. But you need the member states to agree. And more importantly, once they agree, to implement. And this is what is not there, in my view, when the member states agree to have a rapid deployment capacity by X date with X number of soldiers, and then they don't deliver the number of soldiers by the date they agreed. Well, I would put the onus on the member states. And it so happens that defense is primarily and will remain member states' competence. So there's a limited amount that the External Action Service or the European Commission can do. We can intervene, particularly when it comes to industrial policy, defense industrial policy. We are also intervening in terms of making sure that member states are better prepared to confront hybrid threats. But again, the protection of critical infrastructures is a member state's competence, and that's how it should be, by the way. So we're acting on cybersecurity. We're acting on foreign interference, foreign information manipulation and interference. We're acting on all of those, and in all of those areas, we are making gains. I would say that we have made more progress on security and defense, on developing the security and defense dimension of the EU than ever in history. In the last 8 years or 7 years, more than in the previous 7 decades, which was not difficult considering from the low point that we were coming from. But still, the gap between where we are and what we ought to be doing is immense. What's next? Well, Ursula von der Leyen, the incoming or the continuing President of the European Commission, has announced in her political guidelines that we will deliver a white paper on defense in the first 100 days of the mandate. Mandate starting on the 1st of December, finally, happily. Well, you should aim, by March, early March and February, whatever, we will table this. What are we going to be saying there? Well, that I cannot disclose because it's not yet written, it's not yet agreed. But we will be, I will be arguing at least that we should be working on the finance, on the capabilities, and on the industrial capacity, because you need to be able to be, to produce what you need. You need to be able to buy it, and for that you need money. And of course, with those incentives and facilitating member states being able to do that, hopefully they will.
Thank you very much. We come back to a number of points you've raised, I'm sure. But let's go to Tania next. Tania, you were a part of the reflection group NATO 2030. The NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg set up in 2020. 4 years later, how do you see EU-NATO cooperation evolving? What has changed, and how will things change again, possibly, now that we have a new incoming administration in Washington?
part of the contract that Jens Stoltenberg made us sign is that we can't stop ever believing in EU-NATO cooperation and in the heights that the relationship can bring. So you'll only hear good things about this from me. I'm always an optimist when it comes to this, because I think the situation is so dire that we can't afford to choose EU or NATO. It's just not an option anymore. I think the new leadership definitely brings new momentum, definitely brings new opportunities. The momentum is to take a fresh look at some of the irritants and the obstacles that exist in the relationship, and they're there. So there's a momentum, I think, to do something about them. I think there are opportunities to then take the relationship even further. So that's for starters. I think since 2017, in particular, EU-NATO cooperation has expanded so much, essentially across the spectrum of security and defense, from working together on cyber, on FIMI, on disinformation, maritime security, space, you name it. But if I would focus on 2 points that I think are really crucial and will focus on a lot, I think, is Ukraine and defense industry. That's my feeling. And I mean, I think Diego mentioned that on Tuesday we had the EU defense ministers meeting. Mark Rutte was there. It was a very good discussion, and 2 of the main points that he focused on were Ukraine and defense industry. So let me say a few words on each. First, on Ukraine. Obviously, what's happening in Ukraine is an existential issue for both the EU and NATO. On the EU side, we've provided so far 45 billion of military support. The EU is the largest training provider of training Ukrainian soldiers, 75,000 by the end of the winter. That's our new target. And the EU is the largest public investor in Ukraine's defense industry. That's not nothing, right? On the NATO side, of course, I mean, I don't work for NATO, but it's common knowledge, I think, that after the Washington summit, NATO agreed on a pledge of 40 billion per year, and they created NSATU. It's a wonderful acronym, which basically takes over some of the coordination functions when it comes to support to Ukraine. How to say? I think, obviously, we have the same goal, which is help Ukraine fight and face the aggression as much as possible. The more we work together on supporting Ukraine, the better for Ukraine, the better for European security. And what guides everything we do, I can't speak for NATO, but and I suspect it's the same, but for the EU side, what guides our work are Ukraine's needs. That is the guiding pole. Now, second point quickly on defense industry, this is the talk of town. I think Diego introduced how high the stakes are in reality. And I would add to that, starting this year in particular, EU leaders have issued several calls in their conclusions for the EU to do to have its contribution to help boost defense readiness. I mean, EU leaders calling on the EU to do that is really no small feat. I think it shows where we are and the urgent needs that we face. And I think the best ways the EU can do that, together with NATO, but the best way the EU can do that is by using its added value, which is budgetary power, regulatory power, convening power. And again, a concrete way to manifest these qualities is boosting defense industry and competitiveness. And that's a goal we're trying to achieve for long, as you said it, but now there is a new momentum. Our stocks are dry, we don't have money, so we need political courage and ambition to take things forward. I do have faith in the new leadership. After all, I'm paid to have faith in the new leadership. I'm joking, not just because I'm paid, but really this is where the EU-NATO dimension comes in as well, because both organizations share this need for their members, for member states to become more capable on defense, to fill urgent capability gaps, and to become more interoperable. So our focus is, including to the white paper and many other initiatives, is how can we bring EU solutions to common problems that we all face? So we need to see how the EU's work in helping member states' readiness, for example, can help 23 member states who are also allies also fulfill their NATO requirements. This is the logic that we apply to everything we do, or seeing how the EU can help with standardization. There's been a myth that was going around for quite a while that the EU is creating its own standards. It could not be further from the truth. What the EU can do is actually help enforce NATO standards when it comes to the defense industry and military standards, and seeing how we can fight fragmentation so that member states can become more interoperable across the board. So I think their forthcoming work on the white paper, and by the way, on the preparedness strategy as well, will be important stepping stones for boosting readiness across the board, and that has a very strong EU-NATO dimension as well.
Thank you very much, Luke. I wanted to go to you next now. I mean, one thing which is also impacting Europe's security situation that finds itself in is a new U.S. administration, which is in the process of being formed. It will take office on the 20th of January. Maybe you can enlighten us a little on sort of what to expect. What can Europe expect from the second Trump administration? We have it heard from Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, who has said in his memoirs, I believe, if Trump would have been re-elected in 2020, he would have left NATO then. Trump has called NATO obsolete at some point. There's a concept of a dormant NATO, which is also pushed around. Sort of what if you sort of would try to sort of sort European fear and maybe fact.
Thank you. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. We know very little about what the next Trump administration will look like as it pertains to its engagement with Europe. A lot of the key positions under the cabinet level, such as the assistant secretaries, for example, have not been announced. But we do have a few glimmers of insight that exists. And then we can also compare with what he did during his first term. And I think we can draw some conclusions. On the point about withdrawing from NATO, it's interesting to point out that last year, the US Congress, both houses, passed a law making it illegal for a president to unilaterally withdraw from NATO. Interestingly, the Republican co-sponsor in the Senate for this legislation was none other than Marco Rubio, who is now President Trump's Secretary of State. So I think that's an interesting observation to make. Also yesterday, it was announced that Matt Whitaker, who was the one-time acting Attorney General under President Trump during his first term, has been appointed, or excuse me, nominated as the next US ambassador to NATO. Now, I've been involved in the transatlantic policy space for about 2 decades. I had never once heard Mr. Whitaker's name mentioned in any conversation regarding anything to do with Europe, NATO, or transatlantic relations. But in the official social media post made by President Trump, he said specifically he wants Mr. Whitaker to build on relations with NATO allies. And I thought that was at least a constructive tone in the announcement. But that's all we know. We know Marco Rubio is strong on NATO and sponsored legislation to prevent a president from leaving NATO. And we know that President Trump wants his ambassador nominee to work hard to improve relations with NATO members. But let's look at Trump during the first term. Obviously, he was very outspoken about NATO, his dislike for NATO, his dislike of the new NATO headquarters. He was very vocal in his criticism about European countries not spending enough on defense. But the NATO he will encounter today will look a lot different from the NATO he found in 2017 when he entered office, especially in terms of defense spending and also in terms of what the EU is trying to do to mobilize Europe's defense industrial base and improve manufacturing and those sorts of things. But even with all of President Trump's criticism of NATO, paradoxically, he had one of the most forthright or strongest administrations on European security since Ronald Reagan. When he left office, there were more US troops in Europe than when he entered office. When he left office, there were more US training exercises taking place than when he entered office, in Europe, I should say. He spent 40% more on the European Deterrence Initiative than the Obama administration. He was the first to provide javelins to Ukraine and javelins and stingers to Georgia. He oversaw 2 countries entering the alliance. He was the first president to put sanctions on Nord Stream 2. And he was a strong supporter of the 3 Seas initiative. So my point is here, it wasn't quite all doom and gloom. What you heard from President Trump wasn't exactly the policy outcome. And I'll conclude here. The question we have now that we don't know the answer to is whether or not these great policy outcomes for Europe were a result of President Trump's interests in Europe or the result of those around him. And my concern is it was probably the latter, but we have to wait and see who he fills the rest of his appointments with.
Isn't there a sort of, just a quick follow-up, isn't there a sort of a bipartisan expectation for Europe to do more still, especially to
yes,
sort of, maybe could you say, add just 1-2 sentences on that? Sort of what is the general sort of US expectation of what should Europe do?
At a minimum, it's that every member of NATO should be meeting the 2% of GDP requirement. That's like the baseline. I think there's a good story to tell from Europe on what Europe's doing for Ukraine. And for some reason, the message isn't getting out in Washington, D.C. By almost every measurement, Europe is now spending at least as much, if not more, for Ukraine than what the U.S. is doing in every category: military assistance, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance. And by Europe, I mean the institutions, the member states, and also the non-EU countries. But this is a good news story that needs to be told, and it's just not being communicated very well in Washington.
Thank you very much. And to complete this round, Mihai, sort of let's talk for a moment about public opinion and sort of getting public support for this big effort this is underway in enhancing Europe's defense. You wrote about public opinion in the current issue of IPQ. This is quite amazing how big public support is for this effort by and large, including in Germany. Are there sort of in your view, sort of maybe you can comment on that a little, and also sort of comment on the question: does this kind of European effort need some kind of materialization, as has been discussed in the past, as a European army or as a EU aircraft carrier, or are there other sort of tasks which the EU would be particularly designed to do? We already heard from Diego that maritime security is one element, possibly. Mihai.
Sure. Maybe just to take the first part of your question on security and defense and public opinion in the EU. I mean, it's completely right what you said. The security and defense is on top of European citizens' minds. And maybe I can start by giving you a few numbers from the latest opinion surveys, the latest Eurobarometers, and then also from the NATO's most recent public opinion survey before the NATO summit. So according to the recent Eurobarometer, 80% of Europeans believe that cooperation in defense matters at the EU level should be increased. Then they also 80% of citizens think that member states' purchase of military equipment should be better coordinated. Now, moving on to the NATO survey, support for maintaining or increasing defense spending stands at 76% among NATO allies. And then when asked about whether citizens are concerned about the possibility of war in NATO countries, 64% are very concerned. So, of course, we see that security and defense is on one of the top concerns. But then the question is, how does security and defense compares to other priorities? And here, if you look at the average at the EU level, you see that security and defense, so again, average, ranks third. First one is environment and climate. Second is irregular migration, and then a third is security and defense, which to me it points to a bigger issue, to an issue where the sense of urgency to advance security and defense measures differs from member states, and we can see this both at the political level, but we can see it also in the public opinion. So it's a reflection of it. So in the end, what we have, and Diego was speaking earlier about the need for member states to agree in order for the initiatives to take off, we have a different sense of urgency between member states that is due to a different threat perception it's due to a different strategic culture. And then in the end, you end up, for instance, with security and defense on top of the priorities for citizens, and also at political level in countries such as the Baltic countries, for instance, where security and defense is for more than 50% of the citizens is really the biggest concern, while in other countries, which are usually Western countries, such as Italy, for instance, only 20% view security and defense as the top concern. Maybe to move on to the second part on capability development. I think Tania mentioned that there was a defense council a couple of days ago. Also during that defense council, the coordinated annual review on defense was approved by the defense ministers. And maybe just I would take from there three points that the report highlights. One is that national efforts are not enough to develop capabilities to match the current needs in the current security environment. So what is saying basically that only member states working together, they can match the necessities. Second, of course, the report calls member states to invest in the EU capability development priorities, which were agreed last year, which are capabilities in air, land, sea, space, cyber, and strategic enablers. And third point, which I found very interesting, is that also at this meeting, different groups of member states agreed politically, so they signed political letters of intent to develop joint capabilities, joint projects that ranged from air and missile defense to electronic warfare, I think, but also a letter of intent to work together on a European combat vessel, which goes back to your question on maritime capability development projects. And maybe I'll just spend 1 or 2 minutes on maritime, if I may. And the maritime domain, of course, the land domain is the most important now for territorial defense of the EU. But the maritime domain has increased significantly in importance in the past years. Of course, we see a range of crises, Red Sea, for instance, of course, Baltic Sea, we see threats to critical infrastructure. So the question in maritime security for the EU right now is how can we adapt to current threats? How can we adapt to future threats? And what do we need to do more urgently? There are, of course, bad news and good news when we talk about EU and maritime security. The bad news is that the capabilities of EU navies have decreased. I think the number is 30%. Since the end of the Cold War, European navies have lost 30% of their capabilities. But then on the good news side, is that the EU is an important actor in maritime security. And I think Diego pointed out earlier that the EU is doing things. And I think in maritime security, there are quite a few successes of the EU. One example is the Operation Aspidis in the Red Sea. Another one is the coordinated maritime presence, for instance. And then the second good news is that in the current security environment, we don't need big platforms such as aircraft carrier, for instance, or the big cruisers that you would see developed during the Cold War, for instance. What we need now is modular platforms, smaller platforms, modular, that can take a range of tasks. And third good news is that joint procurement and joint development in maritime is happening between EU member states or between EU member states and NATO allies. And I think a couple of examples here, of course, it's this letter of intent to develop this European combat vessel. But then you also have the deal for submarines signed jointly by Germany and Norway. You might have read about it in the news, to purchase together, I think, 6 submarines. And then, of course, you also have the FREM project between France and Italy to develop together and buy together frigates. And I will stop here and I'll come back on maritime later. Thanks.
Thank you.
We're so in sync.
Yeah, Tania first and then Diego.
Just one sentence, since you mentioned the CARD report, which is a beautiful acronym for Coordinated Annual Review on Defense. Say that 3 times fast. No, but I think it's a really good read, actually, if you want to take the temperature a bit on what's going on in defense. And I think since we're on it, you shared some interesting info about it. It's realistic on the one hand, and it's also optimistic on the other, I think. Another two numbers to remember here is also that since 2021, defense spending among member states for 2024 are projected to have increased by more than 30% compared to 2021. Now, that's a good story that we would like our transatlantic friends to hear as well, and that EU defense spending altogether will amount to 1.9% of GDP. It's not 2%, but it's not too far from 2%. Just wanted to add those two.
Thank you very much.
I have points to answer or to follow up like for the next 2 hours. Yes, we got to 1.9, which is very close to 2, but NATO's now moving to 3, or at least talking about it. Okay, so why are we so obsessed with joint procurement? I don't know if you know why, the logic of joint procurement, but basically, if member states buy together, they have economies of scale, they have more leverage when they negotiate with industry, and they buy the same thing. So by definition, it's interoperable. So if 3 member states buy together, it's fine, but if 7 buy together, it's even better. And in addition, you contain inflation, because when you have lots of people spending more, having more money to spend on defense, but you have a very limited production capacity, and everybody goes to the same factories, the price just goes up. And so for more defense funding, you get exactly the same output. I mean, of course, I'm being simplistic, but so that's why we are so insisting on joint procurement. It's not that we have an obsession that the Lithuanians and the Portuguese have to buy together. It's just, it's a sensible way of having better value for money and more interoperability. NATO is trying the same thing. We're trying. EU-NATO. I didn't touch upon EU-NATO. In my unit, we also deal with EU-NATO. EU-NATO relations or EU-NATO cooperation has never been this intense, this fluid, this effective. Rightly so. But, you know, in 2016, when President Juncker decided to launch this joint declarations, it wasn't so clear that this was the case. And now I spend most of my day either preparing for a meeting with NATO, attending a meeting with NATO, fighting NATO, talking about NATO, thinking together with NATO what to do better, etc. So, which is good. And then von der Leyen and Rutte met before Rutte came to the Defense Council on Tuesday. They met and they agreed, well, let's think if we can still do more things. But just to put it in objective terms, this year alone, we've moved from 2 structured dialogues, which means that a bunch of NATO officials and a bunch of EU officials meet twice or 3 times a year to discuss about one topic. We've moved from 2 to 7. Now our bosses are telling us, can we do more? I said, well, give me topics. I cannot think of what else can we do, because, so it is contrary to the headlines that you see in some newspapers here and there, normally coming from very specific areas, that there's problems and this and that and the other. Well, there might be issues, there might be disagreements. Fine, let's discuss them, let's tackle them, and let's solve them, which is what we try to do. And of course, EU-NATO cooperation works staff to staff. And when it comes to organization, we have a little bit some political problems that our allies and our member states are not able to solve, but that doesn't stop us from working in practice together with NATO, which is what we're doing. And what we want to do, when I mentioned the white paper before, trying to find more money for our member states, trying to allow them to buy capabilities, and trying to have our companies be more productive, who benefits from that? NATO, because 23 of our member states are allies. So we're trying to help 23 of NATO allies be much, enhance their defense readiness. Obviously, that strengthens NATO if we manage. One last thing on the CDP and the card. Defense is a competence of member states, but some of the large-scale capabilities that are needed, that we miss, they cannot develop on their own. Not even Germany. Draghi comes out with a report. He says, we need investment for competitiveness, etc. Flagship projects are the key for this kind of thing. Niinisto report comes on preparedness, talks about the whole society approach. But of course, that will also inform the security preparedness strategy, but also the white paper on defense. But to me, it's very clear. For I don't know, eastern land border for air defense, air shield, space shield. Those things can only be addressed effectively through a flagship project. And that allows you to deliver that capability much faster, because member states otherwise, given the lack of coordination, they have different initiatives. There's competing initiatives for different reasons. So if you have some sort of pole, doesn't have to be the Commission coordinating. Oh, wait, it's not a power grab by the Commission. A flagship project that does not mean that it is run by the Commission. But if you have a pole around which member states act in unison, it's much faster. It'll be cheaper, because you do not address interoperability and coordination at the end, but from the outset. And it will be much more effective, precisely because it will be interoperable. So, my view, that's the way forward. For the EU, which means also for NATO.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to look in again, sort of with the question whether you think it's a problem that the President Trump is known as someone who's, well, to put it mildly, rather skeptical when it comes to the EU as an institution. He sort of prefers to deal with nation states rather than sort of an institution like the EU, and also about sort of how much of an understanding is there that the Europeans sort of need not only buy American weapons systems, but also sort of produce their own. And how much of a kind of mind frame is there for that fact?
Well, it's certainly no secret that President Trump didn't get along with many EU leaders during his first term, and it seems he's made up his mind about the EU as an institution or as a project, whether or not this is something he likes, and he seems to dislike it for some reason. As this pertains to, well, firstly, we need to see who his ambassador will be to the EU. We also need to recognize that Europe today looks a lot different. The geopolitical challenges look a lot different now than they did when he entered office in 2017. So that may shape some of his thinking. And also the, excuse me, the Brexit debate, of course, spilled over into US politics, which I think probably shaped some of his thinking and thoughts on the EU. And again, this is sort of evaporated in the US political context. So let's wait and see how he approaches the EU as an institution. But in terms of the European Union and defense integration and defense development, I really hope that his administration pursues the same policies that have been established since President Clinton in the late 1990s. And specifically, I refer back to the late Madeleine Albright's op-ed in the Financial Times. It was, I think, first week of December in 1998, where she gave the US view on supporting EU defense integration, but had three caveats, the three Ds: no decoupling of the United States from European security, no discrimination of non-EU members that are in NATO, and no duplication of what NATO is already doing. And, you know, to all of us in this room or virtually watching this, these are obvious points, but these need to be, I think people need to be reminded of the three Ds, especially in the United States, as we decide, you know, if something that the EU is doing is going to actually bring additional capability and additional benefit, or is this merely about deepening integration for the sake of doing so? Regarding, President Trump will like the idea of Europeans buying American military equipment. But there's a reason why Europeans buy American military equipment, is because a lot of it has been tried and tested on the battlefield, and a lot of it works very well. And because so much of it is purchased by not only the United States, but also other countries around the world, the per unit cost is often less. But I would be quite happy for the US to buy European military equipment as well. I don't believe that the defense industry should be a jobs creation program. I think the defense industry should be designed to deliver the most lethal, capable piece of equipment at the best cost to the taxpayer. And as long as you're not getting into the area of what sovereign capabilities are. And for the US, this would be, our nuclear deterrent, encrypted communications, these sorts of things. As long as you're not straying into that area, I don't have a problem with the US buying European howitzers. And I think it would be great if Europeans bought American equipment. I want the best equipment bought at the best price. And I think this is how President Trump is going to view this to a certain extent. But when you look at the larger trade issues, then I think that's when more of the protectionist, instincts of his will kick in with tariffs and everything else. But I know that's a separate matter from the specific issue of defense.
Thank you very much, Luke. I wanted to come back to a point Diego raised based on his first remarks, sort of the three things which you think are the most important. And I wanted to come to the finance question first. Because we all know the spending requirements are so much bigger than what any individual state or indeed the EU has so far been able to plan ahead financially. Where do you see the big obstacles, and how could they possibly be overcome?
You're based in Berlin, right?
I am, yes.
Okay, not just.
Yeah.
Reminder.
But I'm not speaking for the government. Rather,
it was just a factual question.
On the contrary.
We're looking at possible additional funding sources. It's very difficult to quantify what is the funding deficit in defense. It's very difficult. The figures are not very clear. They're not available immediately. So, Tania just referred to the increase in defense to 2021. They're not homogeneous. It's not so easy. And then to quantify, I don't know, what is the cost of air defense shield? Well, in what? In a decade or in 2 decades? And how many points are you going to protect? And how many radars for each point? And how many missiles for each battery? And, well, you can have something which is trillions or just 300, 500 billion. I don't know. So it's not so easy to quantify how much you need, especially if you have not yet decided what you need. So first you have to decide what you need, then you can start quantifying how much that would cost, and then you have to, how am I going to pay it? So that's the kind of thing that I am busy with, together with colleagues, trying to put some order into that. Okay, now let's say we have a figure. How are we going to fund it? Well, there are the current MFF, multi-year budgetary cycle in the EU is, we still have 3 years ago, and we're basically out of money. So that's not a good thing. There was an interesting article in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago about the option of using regional funding, or at least opening up for the use of regional funding for also defense. Fine, that might be an option, but it's not like you can take all of the money from regional policy and put it on defense. That is illegal. It would take a long time, and it's politically suicidal. But perhaps you can fund defense industry projects in those areas that receive regional funding. That is much more feasible, and we're pushing in that direction. The EIB. The EIB has this initiative, the acronym of which I now forgot, but it had 8 billion. They spent 2. They still have 6. Now they're adding one more. So you have, 6 and 1, 7. Okay. How are you going to spend it and when? Well, to my liking, they're spending it too slowly. They've made a few changes. They've expanded the notion of dual use. So, well, I want to see that flow of money getting to companies so that defense industry can, and we're also pressing them. And if they would be spending that funding faster, then the immediate thing would be, we want you to spend more. So there are different options. And of course, then there's and that's why I ask you, where are you coming from? Because then there's the question, the elephant in the room is borrowing. To what extent? Some member states are calling for borrowing. Some members are saying no. To what extent we would engage or undertake some form of collective borrowing to support, or at least to front load defense? Because if we know that all of the member states are going to provide X amount of defense investment, and this in a growing manner, because they need to reach 2%, and then they will need to reach 3% of whatever NATO decides. Well, that's a big chunk of money, but it will come gradually. So is there a way that we can front load that so that we can start building the capabilities that we urgently need now? Those are the kind of things that I think will feature somehow, hopefully with solutions, in the white paper on defense.
Much, Tania. So you will know from the leading way I'm posing this question where I stand in this debate. Sort of, wouldn't it be now a very good sign also for the EU to put to go the Eurobond line way and put a big number sort of in the dressing window in a way, sort of to say this is the big amount of money we are going to spend to enhance our security, and this is also as a signal to our adversaries, but also to the new incoming administration.
You said it, not me. That's all I'll say.
Okay, sort of.
Seriously, I have really nothing to complement to what Diego said. It's really a teamwork that's happening on this, but the decisions that will have to be taken eventually by the member states, of course, it's in their hands, will require a lot of political courage. And I think the numbers that you shared, Mihai, on the public polling and support from citizens shows or demonstrates, particularly for politicians in countries where it used to be said that, oh, you can't campaign on defense. You can't campaign on strong defense policy, on defense spending, because that doesn't attract voters. So you will lose. It's politically suicidal, I think the expression you used. I think this has to change, because until we change the narrative with citizens at a national level, it's very difficult to make such a politically courageous decision at the EU level.
Thank you very much. I thought this, you as well. You come in as well, but one question would be, or an alternative would be, to have sort of have a defense tax on the national level. Is that's something which might fly?
Yeah, maybe just to come up on something, was Diego perfectly presented the financing options. Just to pick up on something on using regional funds or cohesion funds for defense, and I think the idea would be to use them to advance dual-use projects, such as for military mobility, for instance, which, by the way, is another flagship project of EU-NATO cooperation, where I think it's maybe, to me, it's the clearest where complementarity exists between EU and NATO is the military mobility. So if I would take an example, just to pick up on what Luke said earlier, that we need to sort of better explain in Washington, how the EU and NATO work together and are complementary. I think that military mobility is sort of the best example, because there, of course, NATO is dealing with moving troops, for instance, but then the EU is in charge of dual-use infrastructure, regulatory issues. So it's clear where the EU comes in and how the EU is helping NATO in undertaking the movement of military assets. So I think the cohesion funds, using the cohesion funds for military mobility, is a good way forward. Certainly, there is a lot of money needed for dual-use infrastructure in all member states. It's an area where the member states, especially the smaller ones, don't have much budget for this. So it's also to go back to what you said, Tania, how to sort of change the narrative. In military mobility, it's quite easy to change the narrative. You present them as investments that help, of course, the citizens, right? Because it's very easy for a politician to inaugurate a new road, a new bridge, right? That, by the way, also helps enhance our military mobility, because on that bridge also tanks and other equipment can pass. Now, on national tax that you mentioned, Henning, I think one example that comes into mind is one from Lithuania, where they have imposed a solidarity tax on profits of banks, if I remember correctly, and they use this money for military mobility, for instance, and they frame it as defense is a common good, so everyone needs to chip in, including the private sector.
Yeah, thank you very much. we are almost sort of past the hour mark, so it's high time to get you in as well. And maybe while you were thinking of what you would like to ask, I have one final question for Luke, also on the finance, and then I would really invite you to come in the debate as well. And but Luke, one quick question: sort of, the US has always spent big on the military. President Trump will continue that. There's a sort of this is in his whole approach apparently, that he wants to strengthen the United States even further than it is at the moment. Will there be a discussion though about where the money goes, whether it will be centered to the Indo-Pacific theater? Will there be discussion about sort of doing less in Europe, doing more there, or do you think this will all sort of even out and is more a think tank discussion, sort of discussing between prioritizers and primacists and so on?
Actually, this may be surprising to hear, but I wouldn't completely guarantee that there's going to be a lot more money for defense spending in the United States. There is a lot of people around President Trump, a lot of people in the MAGA movement who are very skeptical about the influence of the so-called defense industrial base and the constant defense spending increases, especially from the more isolationist wing of the movement. So I wouldn't say it's a given. When you hear someone in the MAGA world say that we need a more lethal military, we need a more prepared, ready military, sometimes what they mean is we need to strip out all the culture, social justice issues, DEI, all the woke agenda out of the Pentagon. And there's some people who even suggest that, if we scrapped all of these initiatives, then we can reinvest those funds into warfighting. But the reality is that it's pennies that's being spent on these things. It's not going to make a meaningful difference at all, one way or the other. So I would just caution, I wouldn't guarantee there's going to be, a huge influx of spending for the Department of Defense. I think there probably will be an increase, but it may not be as big as one might expect. On your second question about prioritizing and could we see less being done in Europe and more being done in the Indo-Pacific, the reality is America is already in the Indo-Pacific in a big way. And I'm not sure what spare capacity there is to increase that. Already 2/3 of the US Navy is assigned to the Indo-Pacific Command. 90% of America's ground force is based in the United States of America. And of course, with planes, these can be moved around the world quickly, so it doesn't really matter where they are permanently based for the most part. There are some exceptions. So, this is a very popular talking point made by many, going back to the Obama and the so-called pivot to Asia. But in reality, the situation is already slanted to Asia, even with the number of troops that the US has in Europe. So I don't think we're going to see a drastic change in this, because it's not like we have a lot of spare capacity sitting around the world doing nothing that can then be brought to Asia.
Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to open up. Are there any questions in this room? If so, please raise your hand. If not, yes, the lady over there, please. If you could introduce yourself and then put your question. Is mic coming?
Hello, I don't know if it's working. My name is Julia. I come from the industry, Escribano, Spanish industry, defense. My question here, I hear a lot of the time coming from the institution about the narratives. You say we need to change the narrative to going on in investment. How do you propose these kind of things? Because as far as I know, the Commission has in the taxonomy defense in a really bad position. So I really want to know how this works, or how do you think could work?
Thank you very much. Diego?
Thank you. That's a myth. We made it very clear in the industrial strategy on defense in March that there is nowhere in the EU universe anything saying that defense is bad. There's no taxonomy that indicates to finance institutions that they should leave aside defense. ESG criteria adopted by some pensioner funds in, I don't know, northern Norway may leave out defense. But that's not because the Commission told them. On the contrary, we're saying that defense, A, we need it. B, it has a very good multiplier effect over, spillover over the general economy in terms of high-skilled jobs, competitiveness, R&D, etc. So we're trying very hard, but it is true that that some financial institutions prefer to stay away from defense. That's out of their own decision, and this hurts medium and small and medium companies primarily, not the big ones. The big ones can live with it, and we're trying hard. And when we were preparing the industrial strategy, we had a number of, there was a consultation period. We had one meeting with finance institutions, and we're trying very hard. And of course, the EIB would give a very important signal to the rest of financing institutions if it were more forthcoming when it comes to defense. So far, it has become now a lot more forthcoming, but only for dual use.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Maybe just to add that I think the responsibility for this narrative is shared. Just to complement what Diego said, I think we also play a role. So it's about how the EU institutions manage to overcome the way we communicate, which is not always very exciting. So we try that at the EAS, for example. We do try to tap into more modern ways of communication, says the elderly in me who does not have TikTok. But yeah, why aren't we on TikTok talking about this, for example? Then I think the European Parliament plays a very important role. I know we have colleagues from there in the room. I think they do. I think MEPs actually have a responsibility, if you want my very personal opinion, as a citizen, to go and communicate about the things that matter in Europe and tell citizens why it matters, what is for them, what is decided in Brussels about defense policy. Then I think think tanks play a very big role in taking these sort of conversations outside of the policy bubbles, where you all know kind of what's up in defense, but to take it in the regions, to take it in the member states, and then fourth member states and member states politicians, foreign ministers, defense ministers, they come to Brussels, they discuss all these, some technical, some sexier things, and then when they go back to their capital, how do they communicate about what they've achieved in Brussels? Is it a success of my party? Is it my personal success as a politician? Or is it a European success that translates as a success for my country? So that, I think, that's what I mean when I say that the responsibility is shared.
Yeah, you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, maybe just one quick point on the European Investment Bank to build on what Diego said. I mean, to me, it seems like the member states need to give the political signal for the European Investment Bank to move into full defense. So in the end, to close the circle is the member states who have the final responsibility.
Thank you very much. Lady, please.
Hello, hi. Can you hear me well? Great. My name is Pauline Turkman, and together with my colleague Ioannis, we're from CNV Consulting. We do consulting for the defense industry, but we're also beneficiaries for a number of EDF projects. I am the EU Eastern Markets project manager, and I'm also from Romania, so I have a personal interest in Eastern Europe as well. My question is about this geographical region. Given that there are, let's say, more different threat perceptions in the East, but there's also different sort of threats for the Eastern countries. What specific investments or technological advancements would you see that the defense industry should prioritize in this area?
Thank you very much. Quite a specific question. I don't know who wants to react to it.
I'll say a few things if you like. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Specifically for Romania and the greater Black Sea region, it is obvious that there's been huge advancements in maritime capabilities, as seen from Ukraine's success against the Black Sea Fleet. And I'd be watching this very closely. Autonomous vehicles, no doubt artificial intelligence will be playing a role in all of this. living with the new reality, at least for the time being, of the Turkish Straits being closed for entry and exit for military vessels. All of these things have to be factored. And if I was in this sector, if I was in this space, I would be really focused on how to, really produce that capability in the Black Sea region through autonomous platforms, inexpensive platforms that can have a strategic impact. Regarding Eastern Europe more generally, but also to include Romania, I think it's quite clear air defense needs to become a priority. We can't keep shooting down $30,000 Shahed drones with, in some cases, interceptors that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I know this doesn't happen every time, but it does happen. And even if it happens once, one has to wonder if that's the best use of that, very expensive interceptor. We need to find, so I think the defense industry should be working with the science and technology community to come up with new ways, creative ways of securing Europe's air defense along the entire frontier of NATO. And we need to do so rapidly. We need to look at old initiatives like the Baltic Air Policing Mission and think, does this really apply to the world we're in today? When the Baltic Air Policing Mission was established, Finland and Sweden were not in NATO. Russia had not invaded Ukraine even the first time. And the advancements in offensive missile and drone technology was nowhere it is today. Now we have NATO that includes almost the entirety of the Baltic Sea. We have Russian missiles and drones routinely entering the airspace of NATO countries. And maybe the air policing mission needs to be upgraded to an air defense mission and then expanded and integrated throughout the eastern flank.
Thank you very much. Diego, please.
If I may, of course we have no policy. We don't tell industry what they need to develop, and even less in it's I think the internal market, the Commission doesn't give instructions to companies. But what I would, as an advice to any company active in the defense market, is to take advantage of the fact that since what was it? 2nd of September or something, President von der Leyen inaugurated the Innovation Office in Kyiv. Now, defense innovation is happening. I mean, Luke was saying it earlier. Well, there are other reasons why people buy U.S. weapons other than them being very effective and have been well tested. One is that the U.S. government has a fantastic mechanism to make them available faster than you would otherwise get them elsewhere. But innovation is now happening, unfortunately, in Ukraine, defense innovation, because the Ukrainians are developing, innovating like crazy in order to overcome the difficulties they're facing, and they can immediately test what they innovate. So we've opened this office so that European companies, European defense companies can come help Ukrainian defense companies and also profit from the innovative gains that they're making while supporting them. And so if I were a European defense company, I would immediately go to this office and see how can I help and profit from doing so. And one last thing, one message to European defense firms. Mark Rutte was saying the same on Tuesday to the defense ministers over lunch, or not over lunch, or was it lunch? I don't know. It wasn't, right? We've been having now, we're in the second, third year of the war, and defense companies in Europe keep saying, well, I need a long-term order in order to produce more. If I have a 7-year-long order placed by the Italian government or the Lithuanian government, then I can finance additional production lines. And the orders don't seem to come. At least they don't seem to come as fast as they should. and therefore they do not make the necessary investments because they want to have security. And both Mark Rutte, as I guess Stoltenberg before, but certainly Commissioner Breton at the time, we've been telling defense CEOs, you have, even if there was peace in Ukraine tomorrow, the threat is so bad and the need to restock is so large that you have, at least for the next 10 years, a massive supply of income coming to defense. It's guaranteed. So if you invest, you will be selling all of your production for sure for the next 10 years. So if the more you increase it, the more money you will make for your shareholders. And still, the message is not yet summer, and we have a substantial increase when it comes to ammunition, is 30-40% increase in production capacity, but it could be 100%, and it needs to be 100%. So member states need to place orders, but industry needs to be a bit more daring, I would say.
Very interesting. It's also a problem in Germany that the German companies tell the government, well, we really need this kind of long-term commitment, and the government says, well, you read the newspapers and you know that you will have orders coming. Yeah, but it's interesting that's sort of across Europe apparently a problem. Very interesting. Yes, Mihai, please.
Luke, can you hear us? Yes, very good. It doesn't matter what the rest said. I'm speaking now. No, little joke. Just to, I think, to target I would say the root cause of your question and bringing it to a more strategic level is the point that you made earlier on our lack of a strategic culture in Europe, in the EU, and the different threat perceptions. By all means, these have converged really a lot, really a lot since the start of the war in Ukraine. I think it was a reality check for everyone, but I think what also shows how much work we have to do as member states in the EU on this matter is the example of the strategic compass. The strategic compass gave us the first excuse in a way, or the first goal to get it together and do a proper threat analysis, which is an intel-based analysis. So sit together 27 intelligence services and produce a 360-degree analysis of how your security environment looks like. What are the threats that you're facing collectively as Europeans? I mean, that started in 2021. Before that, we haven't done it, which is frankly ridiculous. But it shows our level of, I don't know, I feel like this is a very French thing to say, but kind of strategic maturity, something that the French president would say, I think. Now we're doing another threat analysis, also in preparation for the white paper. So I think these are very important processes in, if you will, helping member states form a reflex or a muscle when it comes to discussing about these things together and then ideally converging on them much more.
Thank you very much. Any more questions, please? Lady.
Thank you. Ronnie Westerman, I'm the from the UK mission to the EU on the defence side. Is there something that NATO could do more of or less of to be more constructive in their engagement with the EU? Often it's placed the other way around. Is there something that the EU would like to challenge NATO on? What anything specific?
There is, we, as I was saying earlier, have the feeling that what we're doing obviously benefits European citizens, benefits European member states, benefits the EU, but ultimately it benefits first and foremost NATO, which is and will remain the organization in charge of collective defense of the European continent. Something that the EU does not aspire to do. And if it did, I don't think it could. Or it could in several decades and with several trillions. And the situation out there is not very, does not advise to go into such experiments at this stage. So we have that, that's very clear. In my mind, and in the mind of everybody that works around us. And yet, at times, regularly, there are warnings, suspicion, misperceptions. The EU should not build its own military standards. Tania mentioned it, and we were puzzled. We were like, are we? Then I went around. I organized a meeting with the NATO standards people, the technical people working on NATO standards, and our people particularly from the European Defence Agency and from DG Grow. And actually, the NATO standards people say, no, we're very happy because what the EDA does is references NATO standards. Basically, EDA is pushing member states to use NATO standards. So where does that come from? But it has been kept. It kept coming throughout the and then some NATO official once told me, well, I know you're not, but you may in the future. It's like, okay, well, yeah, fine. That is suspicion. That's not, and we see that, like the protectionist Europe, the 3Ds, no discrimination, the Brits, the Americans. You're going to exclude us. You're going to build defense EU only. Well, no. EU member states can and will continue to have the right, the ability to buy weapons from wherever they choose. Whether it's South Korea, Namibia, the UK, or the US. The large, what we're saying is that for those minuscule programs, when you consider the larger pile of defense funding, for those rather limited amounts that come from the EU budget to support research and development, the gains for that EU taxpayers' money subsidized research and development should remain in the EU. That's exactly what the US does when when a European company goes into the US. That's exactly, I don't know so much about the UK, but that they tell me that is standard. It's security based to start with, and by the way, if I'm paying, I want the return to stay here. So, and then there comes all sorts of things that we are. We may be decoupling, we may be endangering. It's like a mantra. The integrated defense supply chain, integrated transatlantic defense supply chain. Like, well, we're not. We're trying to support the homegrown research and development of some things that we don't have in Europe. But that we're not preventing in any way member states, or we're not telling that you need to buy European. That's nowhere to be found.
Very quick points to add, which reflect or kind of piggyback on the first 2 points I made at the beginning: Ukraine and defense industry. On Ukraine, I think I think NATO is in a phase of, let's say, institution building with NSATU, and it's very much work in progress, as far as I'm informed. And I think it's so crucial to make sure that we talk as much as possible. When it comes to Ukraine, I don't think there can be enough talking, because the EU has worked really hard actually to establish structures that now work. They've been reinvented so that they are as efficient as possible. We have really worked hand in hand with the Ukrainians, have established channels, and let's work hand in hand for Ukraine. I am just sometimes afraid that institutions can take a life of their own, or initiatives take a life of their own, and we have to keep in mind the goal. I'm not saying this is happening. I'm just saying, since we're in the process of building this on the NATO side, let's make sure that we remember what the final goal is, and that we share it. And the second would be on defense industry, just to continue what Diego was saying, for NATO to also help us make the case in a transatlantic sphere of how EU efforts also benefit NATO as such, as an alliance. So help us talk to the Americans, help bring to the US also the argument of, and the facts and figures actually, of what Europe is doing for Ukraine. If this is not kind of coming through enough, NATO has an important role to play there, and making sure that awareness is there.
Thank you very much. If there are not any more very urgent questions, there's one urgent question.
Good afternoon. My name is Romil. I'm working for DPC. I'm a program assistant. And I got a question, because if you said, Mihai, that 80% of people understand the threat, 80% of people generally in EU want to defense to be improved. But then still we have such cases as PAC's report in April this year, when the pension fund from Netherlands invested in dual-use industry. And it was a huge report about how you are investing in basically killing people. Are we, and what you said, Diego, that it seems to be indeed a good idea to invest in defense. We are talking about investment from the government, but does the public capital want to invest? ECG that you mentioned also. My question is, is EU doing anything to promote investment in defense and to shift this ESG understanding? Yep, thank you.
Thanks. So, of course, we are doing something. Are we doing it right? I don't know. Are we doing enough? I don't know. We came out very clearly with the strategy in March. We are in touch with the EIB, trying to have them spend faster. We are, there's a triangle. I know I don't remember the acronyms, but basically we're working on innovation and private capital together with NATO, the EIB, well, the EIB innovation branch, and DG Defis, dual use and defense. All of this is happening, but it takes, it takes a certain time. And of course, if you manage to get the private equity into a firm, until that firm delivers what it takes a bit of time. So, but a lot of things are happening under the radar, in the right direction. Could we be doing double, perhaps? But at the same time, funding is limited, and and if I may come back to the previous point, because something else, to what extent the NATO can be helpful to the EU? Not so much. We don't need NATO help, and on the contrary, we're very happy to help NATO when it comes to military mobility, when it comes to protection of critical infrastructures. NATO has, or NATO allies have, a number of assets with which to patrol the sea, etc. So that certainly the EU doesn't have. The EU does not have military assets, and we do not plan on having military assets. Everything we do is for our member states. That should, it's for me so obvious, but when you go to the US, it's not so obvious. So it's a good message to repeat. But so we're very happy to help NATO when it comes to critical infrastructures with our regulatory instruments, pushing our member states to protect, to be in a better standing, and as I said, we work pretty well with NATO stuff, and I think we're achieving. As I said before, what is the most fluid? I always refer to EU NATO cooperation as ever deepening and ever expanding, and it is. But we don't sell it. The message doesn't get out, and it doesn't get out because at times from Aver you get question marks, misgivings, suspicions. That's my. I think that with the arrival of Mark Rutte, or at least what we saw on Tuesday, it's a completely different style. It's pressured, and the guy comes from a member state, so he knows what the EU does. He doesn't have second thoughts about what the EU may be planning to do secretly, which is absurd.
Thank you very much. We are rapidly running out of time, unfortunately, but I would like to invite you all to stay a little longer. There will be reception after this, and there may be chance to talk to our panelists one-to-one if you want. To wrap up, I have sort of one question which maybe we've already sort of heard the answer to, but I think it's still interesting to pose it nonetheless. When Donald Trump was voted into office for the first time, there was a strong reaction in Europe, and it sort of brought back this whole debate of sort of Atlanticists versus Europeanists. Go it alone, basically, sort of concentrate on this old debate since Charles de Gaulle. So should Europe be independent, basically, of the United States? Do you see this coming back, or is that definitely a debate of the past? And I would like to start the reverse order. Mihai first, and then Luke, Tania, and Diego has the last word.
Maybe just see if I understood correctly what you meant. So is this the debate about Europe versus the US in
exactly
defense?
Will we see that kind of sort of the old debate of whether always with the United States, or whether the fact that we have President Trump was re-elected basically means that Europe needs to stand on its own feet?
I think regardless who is in the White House, the EU needs Europe needs to stand on its own feet. So, well, no, definitely. I mean, regardless, and we've known this for many years, and I think this is what exactly the EU institutions are doing for. I know Diego was saying at the beginning, 8-9 years already, where the EU has developed many initiatives, and the member states have pushed other initiatives, which before we had never thought that they could happen. So, for instance, if you would think, 20 years ago of what could happen, I don't think anyone would be so optimistic to reflect the developments now. So I think regardless with the White House, we need to advance capabilities. Also, we knew that Trump returning to White House would be a possibility. So I don't think we can say that we were surprised by it. I don't think we can take an approach of wait and see to see what happens after Trump takes office. I think we just need to continue. So my message is just to continue on the current path and just double down our efforts, because as we all, I think, agreed in the beginning, the threat environment is only becoming more complex.
Thank you very much. Luke, quick comment on that.
Obviously, this is a matter for Europeans to decide, but I would hope as an American and as a transatlanticist that we will remain together. We have to remain together. Half of the world's GDP right now is between North America and Europe. We're responsible for trillions of dollars in foreign investment on each side of the Atlantic for one another. And we are some of each other's largest export markets. And this creates millions of jobs. So for that reason alone, we have together, we're almost married because of the economic circumstances. We have to stay together for the kids. So I hope going forward, we can weather any turbulence that may exist under the next Trump administration and come out the other side just as strong, if not stronger.
Thank you very much. Tania.
Yeah, I think Mihai and Luke just stole my talking points. No, I think what we have to do as Europeans is very, very actively pass the message and then show the message that a stronger Europe benefits the US and benefits the transatlantic relationship, whether that's when it comes to how strong NATO is, whether that's about promoting or defending rather freedom of navigation in the Red Sea and fighting the Houthis, where we work hand in hand with the Americans actually, or when it comes to China. A stronger Europe will mean the US is also in a stronger position.
Thank you very much, Diego.
Yeah, and that's what we've been doing and what we will continue to do. So repeating the points that Luke has mentioned, with which are factual, and yes, we also hope that we will continue to have a very strong transatlantic relationship, also on defense, and also with NATO. And for me, we have a homework to do when it comes to security and defense. The fact that Trump is there. I don't know how it will affect us, because I prefer to look at what he will do rather than what he may have said and what we speculate, whatever. But I know that regardless of who would be in the White House and whatever Trump does, our homework remains to be done. So, as Mihai said, that's where we have to focus now, and doing what we haven't done enough in the past decades, and that is not to be able to decouple from the US. But that is first, because we cannot be, when we're talking about reducing excessive dependencies, right? So reducing excessive dependencies is more urgent than reducing dependencies, and reducing dependencies from allies is less urgent than reducing dependencies from adversaries. But dependencies, by definition, is not very healthy. And when it comes to funding, the US is the first one that's telling us, hey, do your share. So it's very clear what we need to do.
Thank you very much. I think there's no way to sum it all up. What we talked about over more than 90 minutes now. But maybe I'm right in saying that if you link it back to the title of our discussion, we have done the thinking. Now it's about the doing, and that should guide Europe now for the weeks and months ahead. With that, I bring this discussion to a close. Please join me giving a hand, thanking our panelists. I think they did a very good job. Thank you very much. And then I'll sort of thank you for coming, and I pass over to my colleague from the EPC.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we go, my name is Mihai. I'm a policy analyst here at the European Policy Center. I also lead the new European Defense and Security Project, of which this debate is a part. So I think a good security debate, is always a bit gloomy, but keeps you on the edge of your seat. I think this is what will be achieved here. So I would like to thank you to our panelists, to the moderator as well, IPQ, our partner organization, and I would like to invite you to the reception just next door. Thank you so much and have a nice evening.